Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform and encourage discourse.
Great privilege to be able to introduce this event around a wonderful work of scholarship, a magnificent social and economic history of the Nattukottai Chettiars by Raman Mahadevan. I'd like to situate this book in the context of the history of intellectual life in post-independence. Raman is a product of arguably the most maligned public institution in India today, the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Now, I must confess that long before the present regime ever came to power, I contributed in a modest way to this maligning when I was myself a college student, because I was a student in Delhi University, the other side of the road, and I refused to shift my allegiance to the JNU. And I always held it against the JNU that my university, the University of Delhi, which is much older than JNU, much larger, arguably with a more storied history. After JNU became famous, from the University of Delhi, my university simply became DU as against JNU. So till the age of 22, I had a, shall we say, an unreasoning prejudice against the JNU, not on intellectual grounds, but mainly on grounds of institutional loyalty. Till I went to do a PhD in IIM Calcutta, where I had the extraordinarily good fortune of being mentored by a remarkable scholar, the late Anjan Ghosh, who was a product of JNU. And in some ways, I consider myself also, shall we say, an Eklavya child of the JNU School of History Writing. Because without Anjan, I would have never become a scholar. And the marks of, JNU before 2014, or JNU as it really was and not how as it has been misrepresented, the best marks of the scholarship. Of course, like any public institution, the JNU had its share of ideologues and hacks and opportunists and careerists. That goes with the territory, but it also had some extraordinarily wise and sagacious scholars. And it's in that environment that Raman's superb work of scholarship, first took shape. His doctoral supervisor, Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, was a very fine, wide-ranging historian of social and economic life. He wrote on banking, on commerce, on trade, on intellectual history, on Bengali culture. And he was also a very caring supervisor. And if you look at Raman's book, it is I would say, exemplary, of course, in the depth of its scholarship, in the subtlety of its analysis, in the clarity of its prose. So all these three things mark it out: the depth of its scholarship, the subtlety of its analysis, and the clarity of its prose. But from the point of view of the writing of Indian history, modern Indian history, it's also a gender-bending and boundary-crossing work in three respects. One is it brings together sociology and economics, or caste and class. Now, the Marxists who dominated one part of JNU, and Sabyasachi was influenced by Marxism, but not a Marxist. He was kind of, for them, caste was an epiphenomenon. And of course, it certainly is not. But if you look at the last 30 years and the kind of very energetic politics around caste, you have the reverse now. It's status dealing from livelihood and economics. Once upon a time, economics was dealing from status and dignity, and now it's the reverse. So it brings together caste and class, sociology and economics in a very interesting and productive way. The second way in which it is, shall we say, gender bending, is that it starts before 1947 and carries on till well beyond 47. Now, traditionally, Indian history was divided into three phases: ancient, medieval, and modern. And the kind of beginnings of and the endings of the first two phases were slightly amorphous and fuzzy. But the ending of the third phase was very, very clear. When the clock struck midnight on 15th August 1947, history ended and political science began. Now, this may have made sense in the 50s and 60s, but now we have 70 years to look back on our history. And Raman's book begins the story, of course, in the 19th century and brings it right up to the 1960s. The third way in which it is gender bending is that it is a study of India in the world. Now, many Indian historians are bound by territorial considerations. Their books are only about India, or only about Gujarat, or only about Ahmedabad, and so on. This looks at but the Nattukottai Chettiars, of course, were engaged in business, trade, commerce, politics, cultural life across the boundaries. And that is it's a story of India and the world, and notably, India of the world to the east of it, which again is rather unusual because Indian history, Indian intellectual life, Indian political life, Indian economic life, when it is interested in the world outside India, it's usually the West. And of course, now all the talk is about what will happen in the trade deal. But this Raman's book actually looks by his story, and its focus brings our physical territory that the Indian subcontinent inhabits into engagement through its maritime, cultural, economic engagement with the world to the east of it. So in all these respects, it's, as I said, a boundary crossing and gender bending work. And it was a great privilege to be able to read it in proof form. And I commend it to everyone. Please go and buy a copy after this event ends. And I now really look forward to the conversation between Raman and Hari and Karen. Thank you.
Good evening, my fellow book lovers, for coming over to this event. I'm presuming that many in this room would have either read the book or some of the excerpts that appeared in the popular news magazines, such as Scroll, Outlook, Mint, Print, and News Minute, besides a detailed review recently in the Deccan Herald. Though Indian business communities across India were legendary and exercised major influence in the credit and commodity markets from medieval times, the Chettiar story, as revealed in my book and by many predecessors in academia, is unusually fascinating, with few parallels. It's exceptional when compared to the record of other business communities for the manner in which the community soared to great heights, but then eventually went off the radar. Given the time constraint, I shall briefly dwell upon two major themes of the book. The first traces my own journey and the making of the book, and the second relates to what I think are some of the core arguments of the book. I shall end by reading a small passage from the book. My journey of researching this community was marked by two phases. The first phase in the early 1970s, when I had just embarked on my research, which was one of exploring the unexplored. The then prevailing literature on Indian business was heavily weighted in favor of the western, eastern, and northern regions of India, and the south was perceived as largely agricultural and too remote to deserve any serious attention. This was the trigger for me to examine the nature of commercial enterprise and, in my own small way, redress this misconception. And in this context, I must thank Dharma Kumar, the late Professor Dharma Kumar at the Delhi School of Economics, for prodding me to work on the Chettiars. The choice inevitably fell on the Chettiars, as they were unquestionably the largest and the dominant fraction of South Indian capital. The lack of adequate data and information on them in the government archives, both in Delhi and in Chennai, in a sense pushed me into the Chettinad region. This was a game changer for me. It opened the world of the extremely rich non-archival sources, mostly in the vernacular or the Tamil language. Of course, being an immigrant Tamilian who grew up in Delhi, I had the misfortune of not knowing Tamil, so I had to seek the help of my friends who knew Tamil and my family members to help me translate this extremely rich material. I could use some of this material to give shape to my dissertation on the Chettiars. Its period of study was the pre-1930, the quiescent phase marked by the Chettiars' emergence as major economic players in the commercialization process in many parts of Southeast Asia. Between the late 70s and 1990s, my research interests moved to the larger question of understanding of the making of a regional capitalist in the nodal Tamil region of southern India. However, all along and beyond that phase, there was a lurking disquiet within me about the manner in which the history of the Chettiars had been depicted. I therefore chose to revisit them, focusing on the neglected post 1930 period that was one of intense turbulence and churn, economically, socially, and politically. It was around this time that Mr. Gurcharan Das, through Penguin, approached me for a popular, jargon free, non academic history of the South Indian business community. And it was quite an exercise because I had to really shed my academic robe, and writing in a popular vein required a lot of effort. I'm sure there's a lot more to be said. What you see here is the result of this exercise. I can't claim to have said the last word on the Chettiars. I'm sure there's a lot more to be said and written. I hope my work instigates other young scholars to initiate more probing into the Chettiars' fascinating past. As for the core issues which this book seeks to raise and address here, one, the organized overseas migration to take advantage of investment opportunities by the Chettiars was quite exceptional. Migration per se by business communities was not uncommon at all, as the case of Marwadis, the Gujarati Baniyas, the Parsis, the Sindhis, and the Boras would suggest. However, what was unique to the Chettiars was the organizational structure of an intricate intra-caste banking network that was put in place to effectively utilize opportunities to their advantage. And the second issue is the period from 1930 to 1950 was one of fast-paced socio-economic and political transformation and upheaval, which majorly destabilized the traditional banking structure and modes of operation. It compelled the Chettiars, both as a community as well as individual members, to come to terms with the emerging situation and harsh reality, and to adjust, accommodate, and diversify. This critical aspect, which is really the, shall I say, the spine of this book, has not received the attention it deserves by other scholars. In fact, I have said somewhere else that, in fact, Chettiars were a milch cow for the academic industry, if I can put it that way, because well over a dozen dissertations have been submitted in India and outside India on the Chettiars, based mainly on two major reports, the Madras Provincial Banking Inquiry Committee report and the Burma Provincial Banking Inquiry Committee report. These two reports, which were based on surveys and interviews with bankers conducted in 1928 and 29, it was published in 1929, has been the major source of many studies which have appeared on the Chettiars. So the point of departure of my work is that not that I have disregarded the pre-19, for me the post-1930 period was much more fascinating, much more challenging. So I took it upon myself to revisit the Chettiars from the time I started my work in 70s to 1990s and 2000 and 2010. I revisited them, went back to my sources, which I was sitting on, looked at them critically, and the outcome of that is this book. What I say is, furthermore, diversification didn't necessarily imply investment in industry, as was the case among business communities elsewhere in India. In fact, that's one of the questions which I have raised. It's not that the Chettiars do not diversify post 1930, because 1930 was really 1930s and the Second World War were, in fact, major turning points in the history of this community, in as much as the economic churn that the 30s and the 40s threw up created a situation where the Chettiars had to make major changes, in the way they functioned, and the whole traditional intra-caste banking system folds up, and what you have in place is the modern joint stock companies. So Chettiar firms are now refashioned as modern companies, private limited companies, and much of this investment is in the financial sphere, not in manufacturing. And this is because, and this is unlike the other business communities, whether it's the Parsis, whether it's the Marwadis, or whether it's the Gujaratis, right from the turn of the century, but much more so after the First World War, invest majorly in industry. The Chettiars failed to do that. I mean, there are a few exceptions. The Chettiars those who didn't move into banking, who were more into trade, we find them like Karumuthu Tyagarai Chettiar move in a big way into industry. But other than that, much of them do not really move into industry. So I think I'll stop with that and read a small passage which, in a sense, sums up what this book is all about. This book is the story of the community's entrepreneurship, not only in South India, but on shores far beyond. It's about the spirit of enterprise that led many community members to seek their fortunes overseas, with all the attendant twists and turns that spelled success or failure or penury for them. It's about the transformation and diversification of the community and the breakdown of the old business and social networks over time. It is the story of how risk and courage, as much as trust, was central to the whole epic of wealth generation in southern India. In a sense, their story is also a thread that connects South India, Burma, and Southeast Asia across the Bay of Bengal. It's equally one that spans the era from British imperial rule to the modern nation states. The Chettiar story offers a glimpse into a kaleidoscope of changes, some of which were epochal. I think I'll stop with that. And
I read the book as a sociologist, anthropologist, which is what I am. I'm not much of a historian, but it's a topic in which I've been interested for a long time because I've also done some studies of so-called traditional business communities. And as you would all know, the Chettiars are a prime example of a very enterprising and also long-standing business community in South India, which was very crucial to much of the Indian economy over quite a few centuries. I just made some notes here, and I thought I would just pick up a few points for maybe we could come back to in discussion. Again, because I'm not a historian, I might have missed some of the finer, nuances of the argument. But one thing that stood out for me a lot was the way in which the story of the Chettiars illustrates how indigenous Indian mercantile communities really followed the lines of British expansion and empire, and found niches or roles where their services were required for banking, for organizing trade, etc. And this is very much true as the story of the Chettiars unfolds in this book. So whether it's a plantation sector in Ceylon or in Malaya, or handling the trade in primary commodities in various parts of Southeast Asia and then going into Burma. It's a really fascinating history of how this community has really kind of both paved the way, I would say, possibly for certain activities of the British colonial power, but also followed the pathways that were opened up by colonialism in finding ways in which to invest and multiply their own wealth. And one of the things about the Chettiars, and in fact all of the so-called traditional business communities in India, which have been written about by anthropologists, is a focus on the ways in which the community organization or the caste organization was very central to the way in which they organized their economic life, their economic activities. One, caste, and second, family, or the so-called joint family, or the kinship structure. These were the basic social structures around which enterprise was organized. And one of the interesting things about the book is what we get is a story of how those kinds of structures shift over time. And because the story of Chettiars is embedded, is unfolded historically and embedded in the particular historical context of particular periods, especially coming from the 1930s to the 1940s, we get a very kind of clear sense of how they both utilize this so-called traditional kind of community organization in pursuing different types of investment, different types of economic ventures, but also how they get altered, how they get kind of transformed as they met particular challenges. So, for example, the challenge of the depression and the economic, kind of consequences of that. And later, the 1930s, what was happening in Southeast Asia, what's happening in Burma, how they respond, and everywhere where they're going, they are kind of adapting and using their so-called their business acumen, but particularly using the ways in which they are organized socially to insert themselves into new kinds of economic activities. So one of the things about that, and we also get a very clear sense from the story, especially from the 1930s and 1940s, about how when they are beginning to face challenges because of the economic climate, because of the growth of the nationalist movement, because of things that are happening in Burma and other places where they have established themselves, how they, as Professor Mahadevan just said, how they begin to try to kind of refigure the way in which they do business and start trying to develop more so-called modern institutions. So the joint stock company, the so-called modern banking sector. And we get a really clear sense of the debates and the tensions within the community, which were very visible. And it was not an unconscious process. It's a process in which they are beginning to think about how they can best adapt themselves to the changing economic and political climate that they're facing. And so we begin to see them, kind of moving between so-called traditional modes of organization and the modern way of organizing business. And there's a kind of suggestion or in the book that tension itself and that kind of uncertainty or conflict around how do we now reorganize ourselves or reassert ourselves given all the challenges, that itself is one of the reasons why we see a decline of Chettiar power post-independence especially. And I'm wondering whether that is something which, we can think about further, that because, and you do make this point towards the end that, and you just now made the point about investment in industry. This is one of the key themes we see in a lot of the literature on Indian business, history of Indian business, economic history, and business communities, is this question of who, started to turn away from trade and money lending and finance in these traditional sectors and started to invest in industry. Where did Indian indigenous industrialization come from? So we see it with Marwaris, we see it in Western India, of course, Bombay and Ahmedabad, and much less so in South India and much less so with Chettiars. So then the question becomes why? What were the constraints, right? Or what were maybe not constraints, but lack of incentive or motivation? And I think there's a lot more one could think about in this thing. I mean, maybe it's just simply a matter of context, time and place. But you do mention that when Chettiar capital starts to come back into India because of problems where it was invested outside, and it's coming into Tamil Nadu, it's coming into Chennai, but it's not going much into industry, but it's going into all these other sectors like film production, insurance, other kinds of, finance business, stock brokerage, etc. And we see exactly the same kind of trend in other parts of South India with other communities around the same time. So then my question is, what was it about this particular time and place that somehow militated against industrial investment? Except for, of course, the kinds of, the examples that you give of the textile mills and sugar mills, etc. But it was nothing like what we see in Western India or even in Bengal. But at the same time, one thing that came to my mind while I was reading the book is that why do we always ask this question? Why is it always a matter of industrialization? Did it happen? Did it not happen? How did it happen? And I was thinking that one thing, of course, is part of modernization theory. We always imagine that the path to economic development is via industrialization because that's what happened in Britain, etc. But there's another part of it where if you look at even the Marxist framework, there's a notion that investment in other sectors like finance and trade is the so-called secondary circuit of capital, which is the unproductive circuit, right, as opposed to the productive circuit, which is industry and manufacturing. And then I was thinking that, obviously these are also activities, economic activities, without which industry cannot flourish. You need also trade, you also need finance, etc. So why is it that these are kind of denigrated activities? And then I was thinking about the fact that traditional business, I don't like this term, but business mercantile communities in India have traditionally always been kind of marked or kind of denigrated because they engage in money lending, because they're the ones who run the finance, they're the ones who engage in these type of activities, as opposed to industry, which is kind of put at a different plane, right? So I was just, this is just some random thoughts about the fact that, there's a kind of received image of mercantile communities, whether it's Marwadis or whether it's, Banyas or various groups, as, these are the ones who are kind of the predators, they're exploitative, etc. And there's a whole discourse around this, which actually originates with British. And it's there in all these reports that you mentioned, right? And I was just thinking that, there has to be a way to get out from this kind of rigid framework where we're all the time kind of saying that because they didn't do this or that, then, they did not somehow contribute to economic development. And so that's just, basically the book itself, I think, for me, it really goes a long way in kind of taking the kind of concerns that anthropologists and all have looked at when they look at things like caste and class and business communities. And really by historicizing, it makes me kind of be much more aware of the fact that we cannot think about any of these structures, whether it's caste or the so-called joint family, as something which is either timeless or which, it either continues or it doesn't. We see how it reshapes itself, how it's malleable, how it becomes, responds to the economic circumstances that they're confronted with. But the second was about, you also mentioned this. I'm just curious to know more about the Chettiar attitude towards risk. Because for all these communities or any kind of business community, there is a whole question of to what extent are you willing to confront risk, how do you manage risk? And there's also this tendency in the literature to talk about diversification as a risk management strategy. So I'm just curious about how they would compare with, say, Marwadis or other groups like that in terms of their propensity to, or their tolerance for risk. Thank you.
I did wonder why I was called here, because I'm a journalist, not a historian. So I did have a little bit, one or two doubts, but Raman did convince me somehow. I don't know whether that's a correct decision or not. But I have thought about this. I read his book, which is very fascinating, and I liked it very much. And we go back a long way. But one thing that did strike me in the book, the Chettiars. I mean, if you look at my own perspective, when I thought of Chettiars, I thought of them as somebody very big industrialist. I'm from Bangalore and from the Mysore state, the old Mysore state. So when we look at Madras state, or the pre-British Madras state, and the Tamil Nadu, which is kind of a successor state of that, and the Chettiars there, we see them as very big industrialists. Of course, maybe I had thought that Marwadis were bigger. This was even in my school days. But one question that I thought of in those days was, why is it that the local businessmen, the Chettis, they are the most important businessmen that I knew in Bangalore in those days, in the 50s, the 60s and 70s, committees, essentially, Telugu-speaking committees. They were not anything like the Chettiars. And why was that? I mean, what makes them different? And it struck me. And of course, at that time, Bangalore was a very small place and Madras was a huge place, and Delhi and Bombay were also very big places. But Madras was the third largest city of India. And maybe Delhi developed with that. But Calcutta, the three presidency cities, and therefore, and the Chettiars being oriented towards one of those cities. And they had a broader perspective. I didn't know much about their international thing, but I did know a little bit. But in this context, especially when I compared them, but my standard of comparison was with the Komatis and other businessmen. In Vishweshpuram, you get all the Komati businessmen. They were all in trade, and they were all in small shopkeepers or traders, the rice trade or various petes. And also there were some who became a little bit into industry, and there were prominent people here. The road on which I stayed is Subram Shetty Road, and we had a person, brother, and they were in a small industry. I mean, very, very small industry. and they were manufacturing furniture, things like that, like Godrej, but that kind of thing. So why didn't they have this broader view? And also even in fact, there was a theory which came up later under Professor Savashaji Bhattacharya had theory that those business communities which migrated from their home bases, they became big, they became large, and they became successful, and that's because they had they were rid of, or at least the traditional commitments they had in their old localities or the old regions. That was cut off. They didn't have those obligations anymore. And the example she gave was that the Marwadis came from small district, a small group of villages in Rajasthan, and they went and made their money in Calcutta. And the Chettiars, who came from one small 87 villages in lower southern Tamil Nadu and became huge in Tamil Nadu itself, but also in and Burma primarily, but also from what I saw in the book, Southeast Asia, going all the way to Vietnam, Indochina. So this theory, I thought, let me see if there's anything, but I didn't get a answer from the book. I didn't see an examination of the theory, especially since Professor Bhattacharya was his initial research guide for example. So, but I think it did have an implication why other business communities of South India, or even maybe in Tamil Nadu, after all, Chettiars are not the only business community. He has given other business communities names. And they were also, the whole of Tamil Nadu is a big state, and so is Rajasthan. And so that was one issue that concerned me from one point of view, even as a high school boy or college, that's a youth. The second issue is, why is it that all the business communities emerged from the British India? That's because I come from non-British India. And I come from the non-ports, that is the main ports, the one presidencies, Delhi, Bombay, and Calcutta. And that was one of the things, again, from maybe a princely state point of view, you could call it. I just thought about that. I have a princely state point of view, and I have a different point of view. So that I thought maybe the British India had, they were the centers of trade. They were most important, and all the trade was between Europe and India, and also maybe Southeast Asia and maybe Middle East Africa. But the most important was Europe and India, England and India, and to some extent Europe, and England and the colonies. Like what we see here, the British colonies of Southeast Asia was where the Chettiars were also, most of them were importantly there. The non-British colonies, they were not so important. Of course, Indochina is an exception, but that's very far away and that's not where they were. But the British colony. And in any case, Burma was part of India. It was part of, actually, it was a province of India. It was not it was only in 1935, the Government of India Act, the Government of Burma Act, it got separated. So it was not, it was like from going from one province to another, though partly it was, you had to undertake it by sea as far as, but from North India, if you went to Bengal to Burma, it was not by sea, it was just a neighboring province. So this issue of whether the other opportunity, why the communities in British India, which had the trading opportunities, and there were centers of trade, and they had more modern education was there, and also the links with the contacts with the government officials, etc. So I thought that, this is what, again, not a rigorous historian, but that these centers of, this is my edition, not other people's edition, that they came. Now, these communities are still, even till today, the most important communities. And also in Western India, you have the Parsis and Gujaratis coming to Bombay. Again, they are migratory. They came from another place to, maybe not be so far away, but still they came to Bombay, and that's when they succeeded. So, but in those days, probably Bombay was not so important because it was actually Calcutta first and Chennai. That's where the British, in terms of their conquest also, in terms of their this thing. So these reasons, I thought the Chettiars probably, again, I'm looking at it from this perspective. That is why I was a bit surprised by one thing, that is the Chettiars went off the radar, he said. That totally surprised me. They've never been off my radar, I can tell you that much. The second thing is, and I didn't know that, of course, they had these setbacks. I mean, I knew, of course, that they were thrown out of Burma after the independence, but I didn't know their all the details about their coming back from other places and the impact of uh, independence and nationalist movements and other things which has been highlighted in the book. And I didn't know there are other things in relation to Malaya and Malaysia and all that kind of thing. So, what is the so this is another aspect. But I was certainly one thing that did surprise me. Yes, they did have setbacks and they did go back, but they are still a very large community. I mean, in my younger days, I used to hear about M.M. Ramsamy and Southern Indian Petrochemicals Corporation, SPIC, and M.A. Chidambaram. Of course, some of these people were also in public life, but that maybe businessmen also there. But or in like sports and horse racing and things like that, which is also brought out in the book. But this is I saw them even now, even in their fallen days, they are much bigger than anybody in Karnataka. I mean, let in Mysore, for example, that there's no comparison. There's no comparison between a trader here, and even and that goes up to even to today. So why is that? I mean, that was the question. And so why did they become successful, and why did this? So I had two explanations, and looking at it from different perspectives. No, but I think maybe there's another perspective you're thinking about, and that's probably, you can call that a Madras presidency perspective or a Tamil Nadu perspective. Why are the Chettiars not as big as the Marwadi and the Gujarati? Now, that's a different perspective. I didn't have that because I was not from that area. So from that area, you can say they have fallen back. So it's a matter of, the half glass, half full, half empty. That's one kind of thing. So the reasons for that, I think partly, I'm not so sure it's got to do with lack of enterprise. Of course, the setbacks are real. I mean, the Marwadis did not invest in a province or invest in an area like Calcutta, which went out of the Indian nation. That was one problem. That is an advantage they had. And therefore, they faced some difficulty. But neither did the Gujarati. Of course, the Gujarati went to East Africa, where they got thrown out. I mean, that was a problem of Idi Amin threw them out, and they had a lot of problems, similar problems. And they came even to Bangalore. Some of them came to Bangalore, etc. In the 1960s and 70s. I know East African Gujaratis who met people. And I met them, in fact, immediately in London. They were totally impoverished. They had nothing. They came out of nothing. So this was another perspective. So I didn't see them as this thing as. So I think that to say that they went off and also maybe at least looks to me a little bit of exaggeration thing, and maybe it's because just comparing yourself with the North Indian businessman. But even the North Indian businessman, there are a lot of a very small business community has become a very tiny, minuscule set of traders and businessmen have become very big. I mean, from Marwad itself is a very small area, very minuscule area, and so is Gujarat. And the place where which these people, successful people, came. They come from 1 or 2 villages, or 3, 4 villages, or 10 or 15 villages, and or groups of villages. In Marwad, in Junjunwala area, another area kind of thing. So, and also these caste networks, though again, I don't fully agree that there's a breakdown of the old thing. I think here again, cattle trade is an issue. See, if it is totally broken down, they couldn't be these few people from these dominant. Of course, the old structures broke down. That's not. I mean, the radical change was there, but they had to continue. That's the only way we can explain why only these communities and people from them are still. I mean, there are a few exceptions, of course, but these communities are still the major businessmen in India, not only in Chettiars, but also in North India, and with a few exceptions. And of course, the biggest exception, actually, the whole of post-independence India is really the IT software and services exports and IT-enabled services. That's the biggest exception, which does not link itself to any of these, the old caste networks and things. And there are reasons for that need not address. So I thought that And now you see, I was reading about them. Of course, he has given the evidence that Murugappa group, I didn't know much about them earlier, but how they are so diversified. And recently, I've even found that now they've started a semiconductor design company in Bangalore, and then they've started a hardware manufacturing project they're going to start in Gujarat, of all the places. It's like you're getting to the lion's den almost. You're going to Gujarat. Chettiars moving to Gujarat is you're not a is the ultimate thing. So you're not really being a South Indian in that sense of the word, or moving away. But of course, you can. What Raman says is that these are exceptions. It's not the general thing. But there are a lot of the plantation owners in Karnataka, in Coorg, for example. Many of the plantations are owned by the Chettiars. Even in Chennai, I used to know people, again Komitis, again Shettis, who were quite good, but they were not in any way. They were businessmen. They had manufacturing. They had a pencil manufacturing, Madras Pencil Factory, which had an alliance, they had an alliance with an English pencil manufacturer. And but though they Komitis were in manufacturing, they didn't, and they were prominent, but they didn't rise to the level of the Chettiars. That's the important thing, even in Madras. These are some of the things I had, but and also I had some problem with this issue of industry diversification. They did go into industry. They did go. I mean, as you said, insurance, and why insurance is thing. I mean, I was also a bit surprised that you think that Marxists did emphasize industry in a way, but after all, Lenin wrote Imperialism, and he wrote that the age of the 20th century, or the dawn of the 20th century, was the age of finance capital. You had Hobson's book, and yet industrial capital had, and the 20th century was the dominance of finance capital, and therefore of imperialism. That was what the basis of things there. So I don't see industry as that important. Of course, in India, the banks were nationalized, etc. But if you take global finance, it is as important. I mean, of course, in the 18th century, you had the Industrial Revolution, and unto the middle of the 19th century, where you had railways, etc. But beyond that, you move on to the from the industrial barons, even in like United States, to J.P. Morgan and people like that. You got into this thing. So it is not necessarily that they. I mean, whether industry is the most important or they didn't go, it's not fully there. And in any case, it's only a small number of businessmen who are really that big in any case. I mean, let's take the Birlas or the Parsis or the Gujaratis. Then, of course, Dhirubhai is an outsider. He came in, and now you have Adani. So it's only small. I mean, the rest of the businessmen are doing the normal kind of business. You have a whole hierarchy of business. And in that hierarchy of business, it seems that the Chettiars do count for something in Tamil Nadu or in other parts of South India, certainly in Karnataka also. Yeah, these are some of the points I had, and some of the just comments and some ideas that occurred to me, and also they're relevant here. The last point I want to make, which I did make earlier, is that the community structures, certainly what as Raman has described in the 20s and 1880s, 80s to 20s, those have totally changed. But have they totally changed that there is no link between them? I don't think so. But my own experience is that there are links, but these changes have been transformed in newer ways of relationship. And that is the only way we can explain why it is these castes which are continuing to be preeminent or in the Indian system, and why the other castes do not come up. And also, it's like I think the Rudolphs have written on the modernity of tradition. So it is not that caste has gone away. Caste has become, from status and pollution and purity and all this kind of thing, it's become competitive groups. In the political arena, you're competing for resources and you're mobilizing on the basis of caste, of groups. So it transforms. It maybe even becomes stronger. And many of these change also. You have new groups and new coalitions. And but the thing is, so I think we still have the old things, and that today's India, you still have that kind of thing. which of course is not there in only one sector. And even in the sector of the new startups, I find the same caste groups are there. And if you look at a place like United States, and you just look at the caste names that you can make out, you'll find that the caste occupations do not match. No, you'll find that some extent they do, but to a large extent they don't. So again, you can see the difference between uh, the relationship between caste and modern industry, and in relation to the Chettiars. Thank you.
One, I'll start with Carol. I couldn't agree with you more on this issue of investment, the distinction you make between industry and non-industry finance, tertiary sector. Carol raised this issue about, her discomfort with this dichotomy between industry and, and non-industry. I mean, the question of why should it be linear in one way? I mean, why should capital move from banking and finance and trade into industry? The only reason I addressed this issue was because there is a strong body of opinion, in the economic history of the 80s and 90s, where it was argued that post 1930 there was a flight of capital from Burma back into South India, and since the industrialization process in South India, and especially the nodal Tamil region, really kicked off only from the 1930s. I mean, that's when you have the emergence of the major textile industries. And it was argued by none other than even somebody like Omiya Bakshi that the major thrust for this industrialization was provided by the Nattukottai Chettiars. When I looked into it, I found that that was not the case. In fact, not that Chettiars didn't move into industry; they were a handful. But in relation to the size of the community and the total investable capital that they had, the proportion of capital that went into industry was very minuscule. I mean, it is in that context that I said no. Then I was curious to know why are they not moving into industry, especially because there was tariff protection and it was reasonably profitable. I mean, if it was profitable for the Parsis, for the Marwadis, and for the Gujaratis to move into textiles, into sugar, into paper, and a whole range of consumer goods industries in the late 20s and 30s, and the entire jute industry was taken over by the Marwadis, obviously, when it was not that profitable. So, I was very curious to address that issue. Why are the Chettiars so different? Why are the Multanis so different? And these are the two communities who stand out, who don't really invest in it. I'm inclined to believe that the rates of returns were much higher in finance, you see, as compared to investment in industry. I mean, the rates of returns in the 30s were about 6 to 7% in industry. And not just that, I don't know whether the Chettiars were equipped to, really invest in industry because it required being conversant with modern technology, being able to adapt modern British imported technology to Indian condition, training Indian labor, handling labor. I mean, all these were issues which perhaps the Chettiars found it, something which they didn't really wish to enter into. So that could be one of the reasons why they chose to reinvest in industry. As for Hari's point about why only Chettiars, what about the other business communities in Tamil Nadu? Which are the other business communities? I mean, at this point of time, I mean, I've looked at carefully. I mean, yes, you're right. There are Berry Chettis, there are Komati Chettis, but they're much smaller. Their sphere of accumulation. Nadars, yes, Nadars, Bharatars. In fact, the entire industrialization process in Coimbatore thrust came from agro-commercial capital. It was the Kammas, like in Andhras, which Carol has talked about. Likewise, in Coimbatore, it was the Kammas who really took the initiative in promoting industries in Coimbatore. And much later, the Brahmins come into the picture, as far as the automobile industry is concerned. And you talked about princely states, You see, again, here you find a lot of business communities moving into, you take Mysore itself, all these enterprises which were set up in the 30s and 40s, a lot of Chettiar capital does find its way. In fact, if you look at the shareholding capital, the pattern of shareholding in some of these companies, there were a lot of these Chettiars who were associated, but there were also others, non-Chettiars. There were people coming from Western India. Kirloskar, for instance, was investing in Mysore in a major way.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you liked what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review on Apple Podcast or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is S. Sarvana Raj and Ranjit Kumar on sound supervision and production. Artwork is designed by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Sunaina Jain signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.